Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final Spiegel Sohmer Tax Policy Colloquium at McGill University, Faculty of Law for 2021. My name is Cheyenne Nezo, and I'm an LLM student at McGill, and I work with Professor Christians. My research focuses on Aboriginal and Indigenous tax law and fiscal policy, so I am very excited to introduce to you today Professor Kyle Willmott, who is one of very few academics studying this important and evolving area. Professor Willmott is an assistant professor of sociology at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC, which is incidentally my alma mater. Before joining SFU, he was an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Alberta. Professor Willmott received his BA in sociology and geography at the University of Toronto, his MA in public policy at X University, formerly known as Ryerson, and his PhD at SFU. Professor Willmott's academic work focuses on the circulation of ideas about budgets and taxes and numbers in relation to the state, First Nations, and among individuals. His research to date has centered around the cultural and political figure of the taxpayer as a useful subject for understanding the structure of settler colonialism and liberalism. His current research includes projects that examine the genealogy of taxation in relation to federal Indian policy, the use of transparency as an economic concept in relation to First Nations reserve lands, and the operation of settler colonial logics in expert policymaking processes. Professor Willmott has been published in Economy and Society, Critical Social Policy, Law and Society Review, and Canadian Review of Sociology. He also won the Dean of Graduate Studies Convocation Medal at Simon Fraser University for his PhD thesis. Professor Willmott is Mohawk from Tyendinaga, also known as the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte First Nation. How this will work is just Professor Willmott will provide his presentation, and afterwards myself, Sophie, and Emily will be there to ask questions as well as sort of co-host near the end of it. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Willmott to discuss his paper, Taxes, Taxpayers, and Settler Colonialism Toward a Critical Fiscal Sociology of Tax as White Property, which was recently published in Law and Society Review. Thank you very much, Dr. Willmott. Over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for that generous introduction, Cheyenne. And thanks so much to May and Professor Christians for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be virtually in Mohawk territory. But of course, I'm sitting here in my office on SFU Burnaby on Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam territory. And I'm very, very happy to be able to present this forthcoming paper in LSR, something that I've been working on for a number of years. Coming to a sort of legal and tax focused audience is pretty interesting. Somebody that is not either of those things necessarily. So I just want to sort of make that disclosure, right? So in this paper, I'm trying to develop a theory of understanding the taxpayer as a political subject, right, rather than a legal subject. And during the depths of the pandemic, that point when you watch things that you normally wouldn't watch, right? I came across this one television program, and of course I made this screenshot of it because whenever I see taxpayer in the wild, I sort of it's very exciting to me for whatever reason, right? And in this specific episode, I can't even remember what the name of the show is, to be quite honest. So it's about Waco. And the taxpayer made this appearance, right? And the protagonist here saying, I'm not worried about taxpayers right now. And of course, the object of my paper is that I am worried about taxpayers right now. But I just thought it was sort of interesting to show how the wide array of which this sort of bizarre subject, the taxpayer, sort of emerges in places where it doesn't have any sort of actual legal meaning. Now, getting into the sort of empirical terrain of the presentation, Lynn Bayak here, I'm sure most people have heard of Lynn Bayak, or you read about her in the paper. She's a former Tory senator from Ontario. And she was appointed by Stephen Harper. She was the focus of a number of controversies around her remarks about residential schools. So she basically said that the TRC was too negative, the Truth and Reconciliation Report was too negative that its focus on violence and genocide were overshadowing the good deeds of good Christians and other people like that. But I came to be interested in how Lynn Bayak defended herself against the number of people who were obviously quite upset with the way that she was talking about residential schools and sort of basically engaging in residential school denialism. And she said this in 2017 in response to some of these critics: "The speech that caused so much hurt and distress was actually a speech about taxes. My mission here in the Senate is the wise use of tax dollars, and I was questioning why we were renaming buildings all across Canada when a teenage Aboriginal child on a reserve has never had a glass of clean water. It seemed like our priorities are skewed. So I asked for a national audit of all dollars coming in and out of every reserve." So she came to defend herself through this sort of prism of tax and tax dollars. And that's just one instance. There's other instances that I sort of outlined in which she's posted letters of support on her website that use this also similar frame, people sort of thinking through this sort of fiscal frame to understand indigeneity, right? This second image here that I want to sort of introduce you to is one that was posted, I believe, in 2020, and there we go. And it was posted by the right-wing activist Gunn, who used to work for the Canadian Taxpayer Federation and was a leadership candidate for the BC Liberal Party before it was recently removed. He's also associated with some of these other activist groups that you might be familiar with, Canada Proud, things like this, and this sort of provincial variants. And somehow this image came into my Twitter feed. I don't know how, but it did. And I'm sort of glad that it did, because now I can use it as this example here. But it's showing this image of a solidarity blockade with the Wet'suwet'en Nation and against the RCMP invasion of Wet'suwet'en territory, and specifically what we're seeing here is basically a screen cap of I believe it was in BC or in Alberta, people putting up this solidarity blockade, and then you see in this tweet here, Aaron Gunn saying, "Wow, I honestly can't believe the police in this country, instead of standing up for law-abiding taxpayers and enforcing the law, they protect and embolden the illegal blockades." And then the text, of course, reads, "RCMP protects illegal blockade, arrests Canadian taxpayer instead," which is very interesting. And perhaps it could be a good assumption to make that this person was a taxpayer, right? Perhaps it could be, everybody pays taxes, basically tourists, children buying, packages of gum, things like this. But that doesn't tell us why or how the taxpayer becomes a legible subject in the context of this tweet, right? Differentiated against an illegal blockade, right? Aaron Gunn has really fundamentally no idea whether this person detained was actually a taxpayer. He doesn't have his, tax returns, all of these kinds of things. He doesn't know this, right? But it doesn't really matter, because the guy that was taking the blockade down was white, right? And not only is he white, he's sort of in this very moment exercising his sovereign right as a white tax-paying man to sort of end this very, very tiny demonstration of Indigenous sovereignty or in solidarity with Indigenous sovereignty, right? His material relationship to tax doesn't actually really matter in this case, right? And that's the thing that I've been fascinated and irritated and enraged by my entire research career and for a great deal of my life as well. It sort of, it encapsulates so much of the operation of sort of settler colonial myth making and the interesting capabilities and politics that we expect taxpayers to be endowed with. So like we've discussed already, the paper is sort of based on this forthcoming paper that in Law and Society Review. And the thing that we're going to do here is look at how these tax myths and an idea about the taxpayer sort of become significant elements of settler colonial myth making. How do white people come to figure themselves as taxpayers in relation to Indigenous people, and what kind of benefits and expectations do they imagine that imagined relationship gives to them and to Indigenous peoples. So in our political imaginaries, tax is obviously a pretty wide-ranging brief of things that expected to do, right? We can imagine life with them or without them. We can imagine what would happen if they were lower or higher, or what if they were in a different format, how they limit or create wealth, who pays, who doesn't pay, things like this, right? And we can again think about those things as policy discussions and legal discussions as well, but also about how it is that these tell us a great deal about how and where tax circulate as elements of political vernacular, right? And like I alluded to in the previous slide there, right, it sort of strikes me how discussions about tax and taxation are not usually about the empirics of tax, right? I'm not talking about legal discussions here. I'm talking about sort of how it's taken up in the everyday. So that's why I focus on the sort of informal social life of tax as a sociologist, because we get to see how tax relates to a range of things, whether that's property, land, citizenship, belonging, right? And nationhood and things like this. So the popular representation of the taxpayer in all of these headlines and various kinds of cartoons and things like this, and these show up very pixelated, sorry about that. But it basically imagines people as regular citizens in narrative form as aggrieved and perpetually wronged by sort of a cast of recalcitrant bureaucrats, reprobate politicians, and a bunch of other subjects who are sort of deemed morally unworthy of financial support or deserving of scorn in exchange for said support. And in everyday political talk, it kind of evokes this, this notion of a frugal moral conduct, a stern political righteousness about budgets and expenditures, and tax and accountability over the state and the state's various tentacles, right? And the taxpayer kind of like has this aura of this, alert and vigilant kind of subject whose judgment should be heeded and whose opinions cannot be discarded, right? They are in this sense sort of sovereign, right? And I want to suggest in relation to Indigenous settler relations that the taxpayer operates as a political vernacular that constructs political subjectivities around ideas about tax. So who pays tax, who is imagined as not inhabiting the status of taxpayer, and who costs taxpayers, right? And so those tax imaginaries that anthropologists like Nicolette Makovicky and Robin Smith define in relation to citizenship practices are, I think, really important to understanding the centrality of tax to politics. So, there's obviously lots of litigation and cases to talk about in relation to the Indian Act and the sort of tax imaginaries, the structures of tax imaginaries in Canada and how that's structured by law. So in current practice, actual tax exemptions are fairly narrow for status Indians and apply to income accrued from on-reserve employment, sales tax, and some off-reserve commerce. And again, given that about as of 2016, at least 56% of status Indians to whom Section 87 exemption apply, they live off reserve. Most of those people are going to be paying, income, property, sales tax, myself included, right? But obviously Inuit, Métis, and non-status Indians are not bound by the Indian Act and don't access those limited exemptions. And historically, government ministries could not really even agree to the source of or implementation of the tax exemption, let alone the courts, which had obviously sort of dealt with Section 87 in various ways and in different interpretations over the years. And Bradley Bryan sort of pointed out that there's sort of different legal sources for tax immunity or exemption, based either on Aboriginal rights, constitutional rights, treaties, or obviously through the statutory exemption through Section 87. And taxpayer politics is kind of complex to in relation to indigenous nations for a variety of reasons, but I'll mention two. And the first is that obviously indigenous nations are nations, and there's sort of long histories of indigenous legal and political resistance to sort of assimilative tax and property regimes. And then the other issue that I'll raise is that often settlers don't really understand that indigenous nations are nations, and that indigenous people are not simply indigenous individuals who live in Canada, right? And a variety of people have looked at this, and especially in relation to the United States, but some other people like Anishinaabe scholar Celeste Pedri Spade, who's written an interesting piece in 2016, Confessions of an Overtaxed Indian, and sort of looks at the actual lived experience, I suppose, if we want to use that word, of how it is that people deal with the tax exemption in everyday life. So the literature that I'm sort of drawing upon lays largely within the boundaries of fiscal sociology, but all of these other disciplines as well that have sort of been examining tax or have really started to sort of think about tax in a more serious way. And even within fiscal sociology, tax has sort of experienced a bit of a rebound as of the last 15 years or so, maybe 10 years. And that sort of course, was something that fiscal sociology had existed for quite a while before, but people had sort of given it up for quite a while. And fiscal sociologists have, demonstrated in various ways that tax and tax policies have like the capacity to exacerbate and institutionalize inequalities. How it is that these sort of act in terms of wealth extraction in relation to racialization, and how it is that tax has some range of causal capacities in terms of redistributing and retrenching income, or constituting markets in some ways as well, but also through how wealth interacts with the state. And of course, I think that studying these formal mechanisms makes a great deal of sense and is obviously extremely important, but that's not necessarily the sort of approach that I take. I take a look at the sort of ideational structures that taxation conjures in people, and that it's not just those formal mechanisms of tax that institutionalize inequality, but as I'm showing here, right, taxation institutionalizes inequality in sort of informal ways, specifically on how it comes to work on people as an idea, and how it sort of what kind of ideas it does give people. So, the informal allows us to also see tax and the fiscal in places where it doesn't actually first appear, right, or where it's not super obvious, right. So my study really tries to combine the analysis of formal legal policy and strategies in terms of how they structure tax imaginaries, but I really focus on the sort of informal imaginaries through which indigenous sovereignty is attacked, and how indigeneity and indigenous people often come to be governed by different tax tropes and myths and things like this, right? So I want to turn now to the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. They are a group that's really helped to popularize a lot of these longstanding tropes about taxes and indigenous peoples. And my slide is not, there we go, okay. And so they've helped to popularize a lot of those sort of tax tropes and tax myths and things like this, but also have tried to sort of institutionalize the taxpayer as a political sort of identity, let's say, as a subjectivity. And they argue that they stand for accountability and transparency and against government waste and things like this, but they basically have this interesting brand of what I will call neoliberal watchdog populist politics that kind of places them amongst a range of other sort of market-oriented political advocacy organizations, certain think tanks, things like this. And I suggest in other work that basically they've long attempted to create this taxpayer as a kind of political subjectivity that can then consume the very material that they produce, right? That the Taxpayer Federation produces, right? And despite the fact that the CTF is obviously pretty, like, obviously quite political and politically right wing, they get quoted a lot in the mainstream press, not only on Indigenous politics and issues, but on a range of other things, right? Because they kind of have this air of inscrutability, right? Of this sort of idea they stand for, like the regular people, you know, the everyday, the regular Joe, the Joe taxpayer sort of kind of thing, right? And so you'll see them opposite, you know, spending initiative or something like this, and some representative from the Canadian Taxpayer Federation says X, Y, and Z, right? Which sort of gives them this idea that they're just like this neutral group of disinterested taxpayers, right? But they also really help to sort of fill those cookie cutter stories about, you know, abuse of taxpayer money that are a staple of news media, and other stories about you know, fiscal conservatism and deficits and budgets and things like this. And that kind of like folksy populist everyday person kind of thing does give them a big space, I think, to push much more reactionary policy advocacy, which is something that I look at in this paper in the Canadian Review of Sociology that was published last month. You know, as a group, they've done a lot of work on this, and so this is just an example from the piece in the CRS. So what we basically did was we found every single document that they had ever published on their website in relation to Indigenous peoples over approximately 20 years or so. And what you're seeing here is the number of documents per year. So you're seeing, you know, it doesn't look a huge amount, but we're talking about 400 documents over this period of time, and you can sort of see the different ways that shifts over time. And you'll notice as well that it has sort of declined over the last couple of years, which is also particularly interesting, which is something not pertinent to today's conversation, but we could talk about later on, I suppose. This is just another sort of chart that looks at the different themes of the things that they like to talk about. And one of the major things that they do like to talk about is accountability and transparency. And one of the specific policy initiatives that they had was abolishing the Indian Act without a replacement. Anyways, so to examine the dynamic in which the CTF operates and taxpayer subjects are constructed by the CTF, I'm turning to the First Nations Transparency Act to sort of as a case, and that's why I've used this in this paper. And it's a weird bill. It's a weird law in the sense that it's very short. It was subject obviously to a great deal of controversy when it was introduced in 11 and then passed in 13. And basically the controversy around it stemmed from the things that it asked, right? So we had the fact that the FNFTA, sometimes known as the FNFTA, was basically, First Nations had to publish online on the INAC website, Indian Affairs website, schedule of remuneration and chief salaries and audited financial statements and things like this, despite the fact that INAC already had access to these things. And of course, through funding agreements, INAC already exacts these kinds of things. But the point of it, of course, was not to exact any standards of accountability. It was to enact this sort of a transparent specter of transparency through which certain political groups could then demonstrate how undeserving and quote unquote corrupt First Nations were, right? The law is one that sort of still exists, but it's not sort of necessarily enforced in the same way that the Tory party would enforce it. So I chose the FNFTA case as one to sort of think through this taxpayer with, because it generated this pretty, like, obviously institutionally mediated, but also sort of tight archive of where does the taxpayer emerge, right? Whereas the taxpayer gets enunciated in the press. It was just this nice, convenient sort of space that we could look at the taxpayer through. And so obviously I don't do a full sort of historical genealogy of the taxpayer in this paper, and I don't want to also suggest that the taxpayer and tax politics only sort of came into contention with the introduction of the FNFTA. Was really sort of more about inciting that form of thought in people, right? Because as I suggest in the paper, the taxpayer is a weird sort of inchoate subjectivity, requires constant maintenance, right? It requires constant maintenance, and the CTF is one of the groups that does that sort of ideological maintenance, right? Okay, so I want to talk about 3 strategies, as I've just discussed in the paper, about how it is that the taxpayer makes its appearance and sort of sets the groundwork for the legibility of its subsequent subjectification. So I'm going to first discuss this notion of this sort of legal or political bifurcation. And we're talking about a legal and political bifurcation between First Nations people and taxpayers, which I would suggest is basically this necessary element to performing the boundary work that's at the heart of the taxpayer subjectivity, right? The notion that there is this sort of categorical distinction between taxed payer and untaxed burden, right? And it's obviously a really similar point to what Camille Walsh observed in her book Racial Taxation around US racial imaginaries in relation to taxpayers and tax eaters, people who should be excluded from the full exercise of citizenship. So as I've discussed, the First Nations people pay tax in some form because most people do, because there's a limited notion of tax exemptions and the long history of litigation, whether it's Nwegajik or Benoit or Mitchell. And the CTF has really consistently fought efforts by First Nations to exercise these fragile exemptions. But as I try to make clear, the reason that that's done is because they basically always regard Native people as non-taxpayers, regardless of whether it's empirically demonstrable or not, right? So if you just think back to the Twitter post that I shared earlier on, right? And so they have, in this series of texts that I analyze around the FNFTA, these editorial texts, we see this very careful distinction between taxpayers and Indigenous people constituted for various terms, right? And they do that in order to sort of give this impression that Indigenous people are like subsidized by this aggrieved class of taxpayers, right? And one example is in an editorial from in the Herald, the Calgary Herald, where Jordan Bateman and Derek Fildebrandt, who were the BC and Alberta directors of the CTF at the time, basically wrote that the FNFTA was this opportunity for First Nations. And you can see there, hopefully Aboriginal bands see this new law as an opportunity to grow their accountability to their members and to taxpayers. And so that bifurcation between Aboriginal band, whatever that is, or band members and taxpayers is pretty striking and illustrates, I think, that kind of division of that sort of separation between those two categories, because it disassociates band members from the category of taxpayer. And in another editorial that was published in about 20 or so post-media owned newspapers, yay for consolidation of media. Another person involved with the CTF, Colin Craig, extolled the sort of virtues of transparency, saying, we push the federal government to place reserve politicians pay information online so taxpayers and band members alike could know about the reserve politician they saw in the newspaper asking for more money from Ottawa, right? And so band members are kind of like positioned as mere spectators, right, in their own sort of governance. And given that taxpayer is not an actual legal status that one holds except in dealings with the Canada Revenue Agency, the demarcation does not exist outside, in my argument, symbolically positioning Native people outside of this ambiguous political category, and positioning, right, that political category of taxpayer as fiscally constitutive, right, necessary for the band to exist, right, necessary for First Nations to exist. The discursive appearance of the taxpayer relies not only on the sort of boundaries that I sort of outlined there, but it also requires that Indigenous sovereignty is sort of ignored, but also overruled as a general principle, right? And in this sense, taxpayer subjectivity mirrors settler colonialism in Canada, through which institutions, legal institutions, undermine the idea of Indigenous nations as nations, and prefer to see, as a number of people have written about, like Chris Anderson, indigeneity as culture, indigeneity as race, indigeneity as identity, or indigeneity as like an order of government, right? And sort of the taxpayer subjectivity, like I suggested earlier, kind of regards First Nations as just another constituent, right, of taxpayers. And the ability of Indigenous people to self-determine or to exercise sovereignty is kind of premised on the consent of taxpayers, right, as it's sort of imagined in how it's discussed. And in some of these cases here, from some of the texts that I analyzed, right, we're talking about how it is that the CTF strategically discussed bans, First Nation band governments as a level of government, right, rather than as First Nations with control over territory. And it's sort of exemplified in this piece here, published in the province, in the Vancouver, in the province here in BC. It's the level of government very few British Columbians ever think about. More than 200 Aboriginal bands, each with elected chiefs and councils, managing hundreds of millions of dollars in federal dollars, and quashes it. Oh, that's I put my quote and my analysis in there together. Sorry, in federal dollars of provincial and federal tax money is the actual correct quote. So, like I suggest, it subtly sort of eliminates Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous claims to sovereignty by dismissing bands as simply another level of government, hierarchically beneath, right, the federal and provincial governments, and again, one that few would ever think about as sort of really explicit reminder of the expected consumer of this text, right? And First Nations often get sort of portrayed as like these tiny fiefdoms that are basically like barely large enough to warrant a level of government, but they're constructed as real sources of government, but with a sort of diminished importance and stature. And then as a result, the monies that are spent on them, right, come to appear as unjustified. So, I mean, the subtextual message of a lot of the things that I talked about in terms of subsumption of sovereignty is the taxpayer exercises sovereignty, right, and cancels out any Indigenous sort of rights to self-determination. Okay, so the next discursive strategy positions tax as property and security. So we see some of these quotes for the very first time. Taxpayers and band members who will cast ballots are getting to see the financial statements and political salaries for those bands. So in a lot of these kinds of discourses that talked about tax as property and security, we're seeing Indigenous people who have an actual real relationship to their community, to the nation, and then we see the citizenship of settlers reconfigured as taxpayers. And in that taxpayer imaginary, non-First Nations people are entitled to participate in the governance of First Nations because they are taxpayers. They have that right. They have the right to an opinion. They have the right to critique. They have the right to surveil, and really fundamentally a kind of right to that withdrawal, right? That idea, right, of withdrawing, the ability to say no more. But this also guarantees that tax functions as a form of property that guarantees legitimacy in the settler political sphere. And it kind of echoes the analysis of Alyosha Goldstein in the US context and Eva Mackey in the Canadian context. And Mackey suggests, quote, much anti-land claim discourse is framed as anti-government, yet, and thus against what they see to be too much taxation. Yet in apparent contradiction, taxes is also seen as an essential indication of patriotic loyalty. Despite opposition to taxes on one hand, people appear to see taxation relationships with the state as essential to producing the national community on the other. At the same time, such lack of relationships with the state appear to put people outside that national community, right? And so while the CTF is a really stern critic of the state and of governing in general, it renders taxation as a kind of moral good and a form of property, wherein participation in taxation becomes necessary for securing the sovereignty, right, of the settler state and the political legitimacy of white settlers. So the CTF sort of holds up taxation as a necessary good in marking who gets to make claims against the state and who deserves protection from the state. And so the very kind of animating forces that lay behind the taxpayer subjectivity are not just found, of course, in organizations like the CTF and in the space of everyday informal discourses that often sometimes flow from the CTF, but also feed the CTF's sort of interesting fascination with indigenous peoples, right? And we saw it in other elements, right? So like an unsigned editorial in the National Post, for example, which wrote in relation to the controversy around the FNFTA, it seems that Indian affairs is more accountable to the chiefs, right, than to the Canadian taxpayers who foot the nearly $8 billion annual bill for running the country's reserves. And then you see it in these other places in editorial comments, such as this other one that was in the Abbotsford News. And it basically claims that oppression is now reversed, right? With Indigenous people abusing taxpayers. And this quote read, with some validity, to say that the early explorers who landed on our eastern shores first fell on their knees, then on the Aborigines. And that's literally published in the paper. Times have changed. The Canadian taxpayers are now the ones being abused. So these taxpayer subjects basically, and the taxpayer imaginaries at work here, sort of demonstrate this interesting fiscalized racism, how it is that settlers often understand Indigenous settler relationships through the fiscal, and how it is that the fiscal concerns are shaped by these ideas about race. And in that sense, the taxpayer sort of becomes a tactic in what Eve Tucker and Wayne Yang might describe as a settler move to innocence, which they sort of describe as, I'll quote here, strategies or positionings that attempt to relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility without giving up land, power, privilege, or without having to change much at all. And so the moves to innocence that they usually talk about are usually in service of sort of like, liberal politics or, people trying to appear benevolent or non-complicity or being not ignorant, things like this. And it might not appear to fit, and perhaps it doesn't, right? But I do think that it fits in the sense that the taxpayer attempts to sort of remove questions of politics, of sovereignty, of identity from the very objects that it seems to or seeks to investigate, right? So to think about Indigenous politics as a settler is one thing, but to think about Indigenous issues and politics as a taxpayer, right, is stylistically quite different, right? And the taxpayer sort of envelops and renders political questions as objective, technical fiscal issues, and a sort of, again, strategic move to innocence that removes questions of settlement, of treaty, of legal status, and constitutes the taxpayer not as a subject of settlement and colonization and power, but a subject of sort of fiscal objectivity, right? The taxpayer kind of appears free from contamination of bias and identity. They make decisions based on reason and evidence. But at the same time, they sort of refigure the territory upon which politics is contested. And sort of in order to sort of perform that move of refiguring political space, right, they critique Indigenous governance and Indigenous peoples, and they're able to enroll that critique as a sort of this objective and universal taxpayer concern. So approaching the politics from that position of the universal, right, I think ultimately tells us a bit about how it is that sort of taxpayer concerns are sort of underwritten by this interesting sort of politics of whiteness, right? Where, you know, they mark politics as an exercise in objectivity and themselves as the ideal and rational participant in that contest, right? And Raul Carrillo has pointed out the sort of fallacy of the single universal taxpayer, arguing right here, such assertions tend to lead to appeals keyed to interests ostensibly shared by all taxpayers, which are truthfully shared only by some taxpayers, right? So that sort of move to the universal is itself a move to innocence, a move to from having an identity to mark oneself as universal. So basically, I want to say in relation to this, it's to think about Indigenous life through the lens of that taxpayer is a strategic attempt to remove the adjudicant, and instead this sort of taxpayer vernacular, the sort of utterances, the things that come from the taxpayer imaginaries become utterances of the unmarked, right? So if the taxpayer refigures the space of politics, others who enter that space marked become uninterests, whereas taxpayers themselves are figured as disinterested, right? And just to sort of wrap up here, taxpayer groups, I think, have relied on two key notions. One, that sort of most of the obvious forms of state coercion are bad, and that while tax should be scorned, that it plays a key role for constituting the state for those with property and access to property. That is, like I said earlier, the tax is both bad, but also security, right? And I think that Cheryl Harris sort of thinks about this in a really interesting way when she argues that sort of whiteness can be conceptualized as a form of property, right? And she suggests here, right, the settlement and seizure of Native American land supported white privilege through the system of property rights in which the, quote, race of the Native Americans rendered their first possession rights invisible and justified conquest. This racist formulation embedded the fact of white privilege into the very definition of property, marking another stage in the evolution of the property interest in whiteness. Possession, the act necessary to lay the basis for rights and property, was defined to include only the cultural practices of whites. This definition laid the foundation for the idea that whiteness, which whites alone possess, is valuable and is property. And Eileen Morton Robinson has also suggested that people need to really pay much more close attention to sort of those possessive property logics in white settlers. And fundamentally, I think the sort of those possessive logics of control, ownership, domination help taxpayers problematize specific arrangements of Indigenous life and allows them to invest then their moral capabilities and political judgments into scrutinizing and sort of skeptically surveilling Indigenous politics and life. And those are sort of not only directly related to those acts of dispossession that every settler would obviously benefit from, but the right to speak about those issues constituted as sort of objective taxpayer concerns rather than sort of positioned politics. That is, again, that they imagine themselves as buttresses, right, against the state's, you know, politically correct dealings, right, with Indigenous nations, and sort of imagine the political sovereignty given to them through possession as the right to make decisions and basically to act as executors of Indigenous life. Tax is to provide protection, right, against those it regards as lesser or illegitimate participants in the polity. And in short, as I suggested quite earlier, right, it doesn't result in the taxpayer subjectivity does not result in empirical claims, right? It is a form. It's simply a form of political security against those that it imagines as incapable of inhabiting that subject position. Tax is, again, tightly conceptualized around possession and tax obligations, and imaginaries have sort of, again, like I suggested, come to double as a form of ownership. It's not only a legal obligation for people, but it sort of is a requirement for settlement, right? It's interesting to think about whether the state and all of its organs would likely exist if it weren't for taxation. And that's why taxpayers, in the sort of in their vernacular and subject form, and the CTF as an institutional form, don't valorize the limited circumstances in which people with Indian status don't pay tax, right? That's the reason that they don't valorize this. They instead will call this race-based tax laws, as the CTF was very fond of doing for a very, very long time, right? The exclusion from tax itself is an act that presently undermines settlement, while at the same time it allows tax to function as a form of white property. Tax gives white settlers the legal propertized mental and political vernacular to pronounce, delimit, and indeed eliminate indigenous political claims, sovereignty, and territories. It is kind of a structure, a legal structure of a performance of settlement in some ways, right? But also helps to solidify settlement. And imagined as a form of property, it gives settlers possession over those who they believe do not pay taxes, regardless of whether that's true or not, and an entitlement to decision-making, however ill-informed, over those nations that it regards as appendages of their legal fiscal obligations. So that is, that's the end. Thanks very much.